Let me tell you something right now. When a man walks into the room, loud, brash, puffed up with pride, that ain't confidence. See, real strength don't have to announce itself. Real strength moves in silence, acts in humility, and loves without fear. But you take a man full of ego, obsessed with power, addicted to control, and I'll show you a man who's running from something. He ain't running from the world. He's running from himself. That's the truth behind narcissistic masculinity. It's not about dominance. It's about defense. Defense against shame, against confusion, against the terror of not knowing who you really are. Some of these men, they talk down to women because they're afraid of their own tenderness. They chase applause because they fear rejection. They mimic the image of a man because they've never truly met themselves. And some are at war inside. Not because they're gay, not because they're straight, but because they've never had the courage to be honest. Honesty, no, that's masculinity. Vulnerability, that's real courage. And you know what? A man, you can't look in the mirror and tell himself the truth. Then that ain't strong. He's stuck. So no, this ain't about sexuality. This is about identity. This is about truth. This is about healing. Now, if you ever see a man trying too hard to be something, just know he's probably hiding everything. Brothers, it's time to stop pretending. It's time to put down the mask, step out of the shadow, and walk like a man. Not a perfect man, not a proud man, but a real one. Narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is a complex and often misunderstood psychological condition that goes far deeper than arrogance or an inflated sense of self. At its core, NPD is not about confidence. It's about a fragile self-esteem that has been shielded over time by layers of grandiosity, entitlement, and emotional armor. People with narcissistic traits, particularly men who exhibit hyper-masculine behavior, are not necessarily proud or powerful in the way they present themselves. In fact, many of them are covering up a deep sense of inadequacy and internal emptiness. This internal void often stems from early childhood experiences, especially emotional neglect, inconsistent validation, or overvaluation without true connection. A boy who grows up receiving praise only for achievement, not for who he truly is, learns that love is conditional. If he is constantly told that he must be the best, must be strong, must never cry, he begins to associate self-worth with performance and appearance rather than inner value. He develops a version of himself meant to survive in the world, not necessarily to connect with it. This is where the narcissistic mask begins to form. As he grows into adulthood, the man may learn to hide his vulnerability beneath a thick shell of self-importance. He talks himself up, demands attention, and criticizes others to feel superior. But this superiority is hollow. Deep down, he does not believe he is enough. This is why narcissistic individuals are often hypersensitive to criticism. Even the smallest perceived slight can feel like a major threat to their ego, because it exposes the very thing they're trying to hide, that they are, at some level, afraid they are unworthy of love. This is why NPD is fundamentally a disorder of self-esteem. The narcissist relies on what psychologists call external validation to maintain their sense of worth. They seek admiration, not connection. They dominate conversations, not to bond with others, but to keep the spotlight firmly on themselves. They avoid emotional intimacy because vulnerability feels like a risk they cannot take. To be vulnerable would be to risk rejection, to face the deep-rooted fear that they are not lovable as they truly are. Men with narcissistic traits in particular often attach their self-worth to socially defined concepts of masculinity, strength, success, status, sexual conquest. These symbols of dominance become a kind of armor, but inside there is often an emotional boy who never felt seen, never felt safe enough to just be himself. He learned to survive by performing a role, and over time, he lost touch with his true identity. That's why it's misleading to interpret narcissistic behavior as genuine self-love. It's not. It's more like a constant performance to distract from the inner pain. They may boast, manipulate, or even charm others, but these behaviors are not signs of healthy self-esteem. They are defensive strategies built on fear of being exposed, abandoned, or emotionally shattered. The paradox is that many narcissistic men come across as highly confident, even charismatic. But it's important to understand that their sense of self is fragile and easily threatened. Their bravado is a shield, not a reflection of inner peace. In truth, they are constantly seeking something they cannot find, a stable sense of self that doesn't rely on applause, control, or comparison. And until they confront the wounds underneath the mask, they will remain trapped in a cycle of seeking validation and fearing exposure. Hypermasculine behavior in narcissistic men often emerges as a psychological defense mechanism, not a natural expression of confidence or identity. It's a performance, a carefully curated display of dominance, strength, aggression, and emotional detachment designed to mask deep-rooted insecurity. At a glance, these men may appear powerful, self-assured, even enviable, but beneath that surface lies a fragile inner world shaped by emotional vulnerability, identity confusion, and an unspoken fear of being exposed as weak or inadequate. From a young age, many boys are conditioned to reject softness, sensitivity, and emotional expression. They're taught that to be a real man means to be tough, stoic, in control. Vulnerability is mocked, affection is rationed, and success is measured in strength, status, and conquest. For a child who naturally experiences fear, sadness, or self-doubt, as all children do, this messaging can be profoundly damaging. If a boy is told that expressing these emotions makes him feminine, soft, or inferior, he learns to repress them. He internalizes the belief that his authentic self is not acceptable, and so he begins to create a version of himself that fits the mold society has laid out. When that child grows into a man, especially one with narcissistic tendencies, the emotional suppression doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes armor. Hypermasculinity becomes the mask he wears to project control and confidence while keeping others at a safe emotional distance. The exaggerated masculine traits, the posturing, the bravado, the fixation on dominance, are not signs of secure manhood, but rather attempts to outrun the fear of being found emotionally vulnerable or confused about identity. These behaviors are not rooted in strength. They are rooted in avoidance. This avoidance is not always conscious. Narcissistic men often develop what psychologists call defense mechanisms to protect their ego. One of the most common is overcompensation. When someone acts in an exaggerated way to counteract what they feel deep down, for example, a man who feels internally powerless may become obsessed with control. A man who feels uncertain about his masculinity may become hypersexual or misogynistic, flaunting women as trophies or dismissing them altogether, not out of genuine desire or superiority, but as a way to prove something to himself and others. His relationships aren't about intimacy. They're about validation and dominance. Many narcissistic men also display contempt for traits traditionally seen as feminine, not because they dislike women, but because they've learned to associate emotional openness, empathy, and softness with weakness. These are the very parts of themselves they have buried, and seeing them in others can trigger discomfort or even rage. By rejecting these traits in others, they further suppress them within themselves to form a psychological projection, a way to distance themselves from the parts of their identity they've been taught to despise or fear. Identity confusion plays a large role in this dynamic. The rigid gender roles that underpin hypermasculinity leave little room for nuance, flexibility, or authenticity. A narcissistic man may feel internally split between who he really is and who he believes he must be to survive and succeed. He may secretly question his emotional responses, his sexual feelings, or his ability to connect, but instead of exploring these questions honestly, he buries them under layers of performance. He becomes trapped in a cycle of proving his manhood, even as it erodes his sense of self. This creates a profound disconnect from his true identity. Instead of growing into a man who knows himself, he becomes a man who hides from himself. The persona he shows the world, confident, dominant, emotionally detached, is often the opposite of how he truly feels. Yet he clings to it because it offers safety. It keeps the fear at bay. It protects the fragile ego that lies beneath the surface. Psychological projection is a defense mechanism frequently used by individuals with narcissistic traits, and it plays a critical role in how they manage inner conflict, shame, and identity confusion. At its core, projection involves attributing one's own unacceptable feelings, desires, or thoughts onto someone else. It allows the individual to externalize what they cannot face within themselves. For narcissistic men whose identities are often built around control, perfection, and dominance, any internal emotional struggle, such as fear, inadequacy, or suppressed desire, can feel intolerable. Rather than confront these uncomfortable emotions, they unconsciously push them outward, accusing others of possessing the very traits they are trying to deny in themselves. Projection can manifest in many subtle and overt ways. For example, a narcissistic man who harbors unconscious fears about his own masculinity or sexual orientation may ridicule others for being weak, soft, or effeminate. He may obsessively mock or shame expressions of emotional vulnerability in men, or accuse others of having secret motives as a way to deflect attention from the insecurities he refuses to acknowledge in himself. In doing so, he distances himself from the parts of his identity that feel threatening or confusing. This is not a calculated move. It is a psychological strategy driven by deep fear and unconscious defense. Because narcissists tend to operate from a place of ego preservation, any threat to their self-humor is seen as an attack. Rather than examining their own flaws or doubts, they construct narratives in which others become the problem. A narcissistic man may accuse his partner of being disloyal, not because she has shown signs of disloyalty, but because he himself feels emotionally unstable and incapable of secure attachment. He may call another man arrogant or insecure when in reality he is describing traits he struggles with internally. Through projection, he essentially rewrites the emotional script to preserve his own sense of superiority and stability. What makes projection particularly damaging is that it prevents self-awareness. By blaming others for their own inner turmoil, narcissistic men block the path to personal growth. They never sit with their fear long enough to understand it. Instead, they push it away, hide behind criticism, or surround themselves with people who reinforce their illusions. Over time, this disconnect between their internal reality and the external narrative they construct can lead to deeper psychological confusion and emotional volatility. They become trapped in a feedback loop of projection and denial, constantly defending against truths they are unwilling to face. This defense mechanism is especially common when it comes to matters of identity, sexuality, and emotional need. A narcissistic man who has been conditioned to see emotional openness as a weakness might secretly crave intimacy, but feel disgusted by that desire. Rather than admit to needing connection, he may label others as needy or clingy. If he experiences same-sex attraction or admiration that challenges his concept of masculinity, he might lash out at others with homophobic insults, not out of genuine hatred, but as a way to silence the internal voice questioning his identity. Projection becomes a tool to manage the discomfort that arises when the ego is at odds with deeper emotional truths. What underlies all of this is fear. The fear of being exposed, of being judged, of not living up to an impossible standard. The narcissistic man clings to his projected narratives because the alternative, facing himself, is too painful. His projections are not random attacks. They are carefully built walls meant to keep his insecurities out of sight, even from himself. But those projections, no matter how convincing, never truly silence what lies beneath. The more he projects, the more disconnected he becomes from his authentic self, and the further he drifts from the emotional freedom he secretly longs for. Some men with narcissistic traits exhibit a complex emotional pattern that borders on obsession with other men's power, physical appearance, or social status. This isn't always a conscious or openly acknowledged feeling. It often lives beneath the surface, hidden by competition, comparison, or even contempt. What appears on the outside as rivalry or aggression is at times a displaced form of emotional fixation. It may not be sexual in nature, but it carries intensity, emotional charge, and psychological weight. These patterns reveal the narcissistic man's internal conflict, his admiration of traits in other men that he simultaneously envies and resents. The narcissistic personality is built around image, dominance, and validation. Such individuals constantly scan their environment to evaluate where they stand in the social hierarchy. When a narcissistic man encounters another man who represents something he wants to be, stronger, richer, more admired, he may become fixated. That fixation is not always healthy or productive. It may manifest as obsessive competition, constant comparison, or a need to tear the other person down through criticism, gossip, or dismissive behavior. Beneath the surface, however, lies an emotional contradiction. The narcissist both admires and despises what he sees. He admires it because it reflects a version of himself he wished to become. He despises it because it reminds him of what he lacks. This inner tension can take on a homoerotic dimension, not necessarily sexual, but charged with emotional intensity and confusion. When a narcissistic man repeatedly studies, emulates, or tries to outperform another man, he may not even realize how much of his emotional energy is being directed toward that individual. He might find himself thinking about that person frequently, analyzing his moves, mimicking his style, or comparing their bodies, voices, or influence. On the surface, he may rationalize this behavior as ambition or competitiveness, but psychologically, this dynamic often reveals a deeper preoccupation with identity, power, and validation. The desire to be like or defeat another man sometimes reflects unresolved questions about the narcissist's own sense of masculinity, because narcissistic men often build their identities around external markers, appearance, wealth, social influence. Any encounter with someone who seems to embody these traits more fully can provoke feelings of inadequacy. Instead of processing these emotions directly, they channel them into rivalry, idolization, or even secret admiration. They may copy the man's behavior or style while simultaneously resenting him for embodying traits they feel disconnected from. This creates an emotional push and pull that can be hard to untangle, even for the narcissist himself. In some cases, the narcissistic man may be unaware that his obsession with another man's body, confidence, or charisma is rooted in unconscious desire, not necessarily romantic or sexual desire, but the longing to possess what that man seems to represent. The narcissist sees in the other man a mirror, a projection of the self he wishes he could fully embody. But because he cannot reconcile this with his own feelings of inferiority or confusion, the admiration turns into projection, judgment, or imitation. This emotional complexity is often heightened by societal pressures around masculinity, which discourage men from openly expressing admiration, vulnerability, or emotional connection with one another. The narcissistic man already invested in a rigid self-immunement, finds it almost impossible to admit such feelings, even to himself. Instead of saying, I admire that man, or I wish I had that quality, he deflects the emotion into passive-aggressive behavior or mockery. Yet the emotional truth remains. He is drawn to that man for reasons he cannot explain or accept. That draw, buried in envy and denial,